This presentation, titled Using the Process Approach for Food Safety Auditing, comes to us from Colin Christmas. Colin joined Eagle in 2019 as a managing director to support Eagle's international growth. He is an experienced professional with more than 20 years in the food industry working for Nestle. Colin has had the privilege to live and work in numerous countries around the world, which helped him develop an excellent understanding for process, systems, and standardization while working in different cultures. He has a bachelor's degree in computing and business analytics from the University of Huddersfield, with specialization in quality control, quality management systems, and business process management. He also has program completion certificates from Wageningen University and the Research for Food Safety Management, and from the London Business School for an Executive Leadership Program. And with that, take it away, Colin.
Thank you very much for the intro, Mike. So today I'm going to be talking about the process approach for food safety auditing. As Mike mentioned, I'm Colin Christmas. I'm the Managing Director at Eagle Certification Group. So let me just start off with some high-level context of why this is important, why the process approach is important in food safety auditing. Well, essentially, food manufacturing is a process industry. So this is a production method that creates goods by combining supplies, ingredients, raw materials used in recipes or formulas. And why is that really important? Well, what we find in manufacturing, there are two very distinct processing or manufacturing techniques. There are process manufacturing. So example sectors is food and beverage, it's pharma, it's the process approach. So essentially this is ingredients, formulas, and bulk materials. In comparison, there is a discrete manufacturing sector, and this is automotive, this is aerospace. And this is really a product approach. So you're going to hear concept of, is it a process industry or is it a product industry? And automotive aerospace is a product approach. This is parts, bills, and materials, and individual units. So why is that important for an auditor, you might ask? Well, if you're a food safety auditor, this is a very good quote from Steve Olson, who is a retired USDA inspector in the regulatory sector. And he says compliant product has to come from a process to comply. You cannot inspect a product to comply. It has to be produced to comply. So this is really important for a food safety auditor. You have to look at understanding the process, because this is where the observations, this is where the strengths and weaknesses will come from in a food safety management system. Inspection at the end of a product line for food is important. You still have inspections for sure, but ultimately the understanding of where the compliance, where the opportunities are, comes from the process itself. And this is the ingredients, this is the bulk materials, this is the step-by-step manufacture of the finished products that we have to send or sell to the consumer. So let's look at the definitions and why this is important. Well, the common requirement for a food safety management system, all food safety processes must be established, they must be compliant and monitored. So this is key. So hopefully now you're forming the picture of why the processes are super important and even more important in the food industry and with food manufacturing. So what is a process? The definition from ISO 22000 is this is a set of interrelated or interacting activities which transforms inputs and outputs. So we're looking at this, it's very linear, inputs and outputs, that's the process. What goes on in between and how do we audit that is critical for understanding whether we have a robust food safety management system. And then the definition of the process approach. This is defined as a tool for managing identified processes of the organization, their interactions to achieve intended results and avoid unwanted results. So this is key. And ultimately, this is what we're going to discuss further in the presentation today. So let's look at a food safety audit. We have to understand as an auditor, when we're looking at a food safety management system, it's not just about conformance against individual requirements. This is really regarded as prescriptive. This is a checklist approach. And ultimately, if it's just ticking off individual requirements, you will not have a clear indication or a confidence level that a food safety management system is robust enough to avoid food safety failures. So the process approach essentially is the objective is to confirm the overall purpose. This is a much more holistic approach. What is the purpose of the food safety management system for that organization? And this is regarded as a broad process-based approach. As an auditor, you have to identify and confirm the overall purpose, not just the individual requirements. So as I mentioned before, the prescriptive approach, it is very important for food safety. Checklists are necessary. So I just want to reiterate the importance of checklists, the importance of individual requirements. However, it's also important to say checklists must complement an overall process-based approach. And as an auditor, you need good questioning techniques to obtain the maximum information you can from checklists and from other areas that you will cover during a food safety audit. So let's look at the processes. This is really important. This is one key slide I want you to focus on. So as a food safety auditor, just think of 3 separate process areas within an organization. You have the high-level processes. They're regarded as food safety management processes. You have realization processes. This is the intricate step-by-step activities. This is PRPs. This is other operational activities to actually realize the product that is being produced. And then finally, you have support functions. You have support processes and the important part they play within an organization supporting the food safety management system. So as an auditor, when you go into an organization, you have to look at these 3 areas and be confident that all 3 areas, these 3 areas of processes are fully defined, fully implemented, and fully working in an organization before you sign off at the end of an audit. So we're going to go through these 3 process areas. I wanted to start off with management processes. So management processes, what are they? They are things like policy, objective setting, monitoring, verification, and improvement. This is where the leadership are accountable and responsible for these processes. And I think it's important as an auditor that we interrogate the leadership in quite an in-depth level. This is not a food safety management system isn't all about spending all of your time on HACCP studies. You have to understand how the leadership have implemented the system. So this is a good example. So here's a question. What is the context of your organization? You're looking for the leadership to be able to explain the risks, the opportunities associated to the organization. What are their interested parties? What are their internal and external issues? Essentially, the context of the organization is the purpose. So the leadership must be able to confidently answer that question. Next question, who communicates the food safety policy? Who communicates key food safety messages to the organization? This is an interesting one. You will see that sometimes the food safety team leader, the quality manager, is actually communicating these key messages to the organization. This is a concern because ultimately the accountability of a food safety management system sits with the head of the organization. This can be the factory manager in a lot of cases, not the quality manager of the organization. So we want to see the head of the organization communicating those key policies. They need to own the food safety management system. And then in addition, who allocates roles and responsibilities? So roles and responsibilities must be allocated by the head of the organization. We must be seeing different organizations, different heads within the organization taking accountability. Engineering must own things like line release and line repairs. Quality have input to that process. We must see procurement owning the vendor approval process. Quality have input to that process. We must see manufacturing, the operations team owning in process. We must see logistics owning the goods inwards process. This is where roles and responsibilities are critical to make sure that there is shared accountability and responsibility across the organization. Another question for leadership, to ask them how the objectives of the food safety management system are linked to their business objectives. In a lot of cases, food safety objectives must be linked with no conflicts, and in a lot of cases there are conflicts. Examples I've seen is procurement having a 10% cost reduction for commodities. This has triggered procurement to go out and find cheaper and more cost-effective suppliers. At the same time, the food safety management objective is to reduce quality defects from suppliers by 10%. So that could be a potential conflict if you're moving to cheaper suppliers and working with new suppliers at the same time that you have to reduce quality defects and problems with your suppliers from a food safety perspective. Is a potential conflict. So as an auditor, spend some time looking at the business objectives, not just the food safety management system objectives, and make sure there's no conflicts. Another question for leadership: what are the expected outcomes from your food safety management system? And how do you measure those expected outcomes? There's a clue here that in some cases, this could be a tough question for the leadership. They may not have fully defined their expectations, their expected outcomes, and the measures may not be there to support that. And ultimately, the challenge for leadership is if they are not measuring the expected outcomes, they cannot manage it. So spend some time looking at understanding how the leadership perceive their food safety management system, what they expect from that system. Good examples for management is to say some high-level measures. They expect a reduction in food safety recalls and withdrawals. Leadership expect a reduction in issues related to applicable statutory regulatory food safety requirements. It could be that the leadership expect a reduction in cost of non-quality issues related to food safety requirements. These are the things you would hope to see that a leadership could confidently answer and have good measures to indicate that there is improvement and this is being monitored and measured. So from management processes, now to look at the realization processes. I think as a food safety auditor, this is probably where we spend most of our time. It is very important. So the other processes are important, but this is very critical to understand whether really the processes are driving the right intended results. So realization processes, what are they? They are operational planning and control. This includes your PRP, your prerequisite programs. This includes traceability programs, and most importantly, hazard control. So when we look at hazard control, I think something that every food safety auditor is very familiar with is process flow diagrams. These are in every single food safety management system. And here's a very basic example of reception of raw material to delivery to the customer. And these are used for hazard identification in HACCP. So very familiar with questions with this. We're asking questions with what, with who, how many. That is a good mantra to ask these type of questions when you're interrogating such a process flow for HACCP. And then a good question as a food safety auditor that I ask organizations: how did you map, prioritize, and communicate your most important processes related to your food safety management system? What we're looking for from a good organization is the organization has prioritized their processes based on risk. Do they have something like a risk register that identifies what is the most high likelihood of failure and the most severe consequences? Have they communicated these most important processes as their must-win battles? Has that been really clearly communicated outside of the food safety or the quality department? Does the whole organization know what is important in terms of food safety? And then once those processes have been identified, and once those processes have been added into objectives, the question is, how well has an organization mapped those processes? And here's a couple of tools that I wanted to show to you that could be used. They're not mandatory, but we would hope that forward-thinking organizations have mapped their high-level or most important processes. And once that's mapped, here's an example of a turtle diagram. As I mentioned before, we're looking at the inputs and outputs, but the process will cover the how, which is multiple procedures, multiple instructions, checklists, and templates, because the process will go through multiple procedures. It'll cross different functions within the organization. Then once they've identified the process, how are they measuring that? What are their performance indicators? This would be regarded as a process performance indicator. This is underneath a key performance indicator. Have they mapped their processes and are they measuring them? Then with who? Do they have the right people? Are they trained? Do they have the right knowledge? Do they have the right skills? This is also the roles and responsibility. This is leadership. Have leadership allocated the right who? Have they allocated the right roles and responsibilities? Have they identified who is responsible? Have they identified who's accountable? This can use things like RACI, which is consulted, informed as well. So how well has an organization mapped the responsibilities? And then finally, with what? Equipment, materials. This is a process industry, remember. So this is ingredients, this is bulk materials, what equipment is being used. And then ultimately, once you have that mapped out, how well are they linked to other processes they're associated to? That is regarded as uniformity of output. So here's a good example. This is an example from an organization that would identify that pathogen management would be their most critical process. Why is that the case? Well, pathogen management accounts for the top 3 recalls every single year globally for food manufacturing. So here's a good example of some sub-processes. Within pathogen management, we see here separation from raw to ready to eat. Following good manufacturing practices, controlled floor conditions for zoning, for example, sanitary design of equipment and facilities, effective sanitization, procedures and controls, and environmental monitoring. So here I would regard these as sub-processes within an overall critical process for food safety. And then when you have these sub-processes, how can an organization map them? So here's another example. I've showed you turtle diagram. Something very similar is something called SIPOC, supplier, input, process, output, customer. And when you map these, so these are the processes from the previous page, ready to eat, GMPs, floor conditions, sanitary design, sanitization, environmental monitoring. So once that's done, how well has an organization identified who's responsible, accountable for the input? What documents, what procedures are in place? What other information, what checklists, what templates are being used as part of that process? What is the expected output? What documents, what pieces of information, tasks, etc. would come from that output? And ultimately, who is responsible for receiving that output and who's accountable for that output? And this is very linear. So I just wanted to highlight SIPOC is very linear, but you also have a good organization will demonstrate that they're not just thinking in a linear format. They are also looking at interested parties, internal issues, external issues. So that will give you an overall picture of what your process is and is it functioning how you expect it to be functioning. And then from an auditor's point of view, if you see these type of diagrams, you start with the output first and you work your way backwards. This is a very common format for auditing the process approach. So with the output, the question you can ask is that the expected output? Is the person who's received that output, are they satisfied with that output? Is it delivering the intended results? And then ultimately for an organization, as I mentioned before, for a food safety auditor, you may see the HACCP process flows. You may see some flow diagrams. You may not see SIPOC, you may not see turtle, you may not see other visualizations. So this may not lead to a non-conformity in a food safety audit, but it may give you the opportunity to document this as an opportunity for improvement for an organization. If they haven't fully identified their high-level or key processes, their must-win battles, if they haven't visualized them, then this is a good opportunity to challenge an organization on why they have not done that. And then supporting processes. So supporting processes, these are really critical as well. And sometimes they are forgotten in food safety audits and not fully interrogated for as much as they should be interrogated. And ultimately, they are supporting the food safety management system. So we look at HR. Are HR owning the training records, for example, for the food safety management system? Is that an opportunity to centralize record control for training records? Finance and control. Is there approval for CapEx, for food safety management system requirements that need to support the food safety management system? Legal. Is there a fully functioning legal department that understands the regulatory requirements in the market? The comms team. Is there effective communications to external parties, interested parties, internal, external issues? Are they fully communicated within the organization? Information technology. This is record control as well. This is the ability to understand all of the documentation information that's needed to sustain the food safety management system. And then finally, site security. This relates to food defense. This relates to food fraud. How secure is the site to prevent tampering with any of the materials, ingredients, or products that the organization is manufacturing? And then from here, an auditor must take time to understand what is required from the process they are auditing. It's not random. Once you understand what the process is and the process that you're auditing, then you pick the procedures, then you pick the forms, then you pick the checklists. They must be associated to the same process. And once you go through those associated documentation, you can identify whether that process is managed and controlled effectively. Okay, so we've mapped our processes. We've talked about 3 process levels. Now, as an auditor, what do you do with that? You see an organization has accurately mapped their processes, but how do you interrogate that? Well, plan, do, check, act. So this is a tool that's used by auditors. It's a questioning technique to obtain maximum information about a process and to determine conformance and improvement to the requirements of the food safety management system. PDCA. So let's go back and understand that we have 2 levels here. We have the organizational level. So this is the management process. PDCA questions can be applied when you are interrogating leadership and the management processes. In addition, you need to apply these questions at the operational level. So this is the realization processes. This is the support processes. So I think that's a key concept to take away today. Think organization, think operational. They're 2 different levels. And then when you're looking at processes, what's the mantra that I typically look at to go through and understand that an organization have the processes under control? Have they been analyzed? Have they been monitored? Have they been measured? Have they been improved? So those are the 4 areas that I will be ticking off when I'm doing a food safety audit. And then what are the PDCA questions? So PDCA questions is ultimately split between plan, do, check, and act. And one thing I've seen that in my 10 years of working and doing food safety audits and witnessing food safety auditors is that the good auditors I've observed are the ones that are using PDCA questioning technique. And one of the first times I learned this, maybe 10 years ago, was I was witnessing an auditor, and I didn't realize that he was even using this technique until I paid more attention and realized he's going through plan questions, do questions, check questions, act questions. And since then, the most effective and excellent auditors I have come across are the people that use PDCA questions. And ultimately, this technique is super effective, and it will identify strengths and weaknesses of an organization's food safety management system that may not come up from a checklist approach. If you're just ticking off requirements and not using a technique such as PDCA, you will miss opportunities to identify strengths and weaknesses. So here's a good example. PDCA questions can be structured for a broad range of food safety failures. What I have come across that's common in the process approach is miscommunication, conflicting priorities, lack of awareness, lack of competency. So these are failures that are not typically identified when using a checklist. When you go through asking PDCA type questions, you will identify these common food safety failures. And that's why it's important to give you a confidence level that is the food safety management system truly functioning within that organization. And then from here, we all know as food safety auditors, we must look for evidence of conformance against the standard that we're auditing. In addition, for a process-based audit, the auditor must be able to determine uniformity of output. If that's one key takeaway today, one phrase that must be sticking in your head as an auditor is there uniformity of output? So essentially, there must be an understanding definition of the integration and interdependent processes. Where organizations foul with food safety incidents in their organization is that input to output, that connection point of an integration or an interdependent process. And as something is handed over from one function to another, is it fully communicated? Is there the right awareness? Is there the right resource in place? And ultimately, is the person receiving the output from the previous function as part of that process, is that meeting the desired results? And as an auditor, you must be looking for that evidence that that is aligned and that meets requirements. So how do we do that? Well, this is really about audit trails. So audit trails is the systematic approach to collecting evidence based on specific samples. And the output is a series of interrelated processes that meet the expected outcomes. So the audit trails is ultimately you are going across multiple processes with that audit trail. And that is a really skillful thing that an auditor must be competent at in the process approach. I've seen auditors come into an organization, it was making a confectionery product. That auditor actually, as part of the opening meeting, bought the confectionery product in a grocery store on the way to the factory, and he put that on the table, and the whole 2 or 3 day audit was associated around that product that factory had made a number of months prior to the audit even happening. So from that product was made on a production run that was done on 3rd shift. He came into the factory at 2 o'clock in the morning and was interrogating the processes related to that production run that would happen months before. The ingredients, the mock recall, the traceability exercise, the traceability to the finished product, all was associated around that one product. Following the process approach, that was the focal point, and a good example of all of the documentation that he requested was associated to processes associated to that particular product. Okay, so here with this, then we have the starting point, which is identifying the process path and the controls that are applied. It's important when you're selecting relevant samples that they must not be taken at different stages of the process that are not related to the process part. As I mentioned before, any checklists, any templates, any documentation, any records must all be associated to that process path that you have identified. And then ultimately, as I mentioned before, once you have that, is the uniformity of output throughout that process. And at the end of the chain, as an auditor, you must be able to verify that that process delivered the intended result. Okay, and from here, moving on from PDCA type questions and process-based approach interrogation. The other key thing for a food safety auditor is to understand risk-based thinking is truly important in a food safety audit. We've moved away from preventative controls to much more focus on risk-based thinking. And this is understanding that there could be an opportunity to take advantage of opportunities in addition to preventing undesirable results. So essentially, risk-based thinking is essential for achieving an effective food safety management system, and the organization must be able to demonstrate they understand this concept. Again, when we look at risk-based thinking, there's 2 levels. So look at the organizational level. This is the food safety management process. Look at the operational level. This is the realization processes. This is the support processes. So in your audit approach, understand that you need to interrogate and be confident that the organization has understand risk-based thinking at both levels. So I think we're very comfortable with the first one, the operational risk. So this is all about hazard assessment and hazard control plans. And ultimately, this is where actions are taken to minimize risk with negative results. Auditors spend a lot of time thinking and working around operational risk. So this is, I'm quite confident that everyone in the audience today will understand that. The opportunity, I believe, is understanding how to audit organizational risk. So this is somewhat different. This is about the effect of uncertainty. And this actually can have positive and negative consequences. And how does an organization understand that? And how do they pursue the positive opportunities? And how do they mitigate the negative consequences? So when we look at organizational risk, what's the objective evidence? This is things like SWOT analysis, supplier feedback, customer feedback, regulatory analysis, competitor analysis. And ultimately, as an auditor, you must look for observations that can be related to whether these analyses are applied in the management processes. Has management, have the leadership taken into account this kind of analysis? Is it part of their production planning? Is it part of their operational reviews? Is it taken into account for corrective actions? And are corrective actions applied when there are weaknesses associated to organizational risk? So as an auditor, if you're not looking at organizational risk, you need to be requesting these kind of documents. You need to understand if an organization has fully done that. That takes you back to leadership, and that is really important. And I think that's the difference today between organizational risk, which is probably less observations I see compared to the other risk, which is the operational level risk. And then finally, the audit-based, process-based audit conclusions. So what are the things that you're looking for? Ultimately, did the organization implement a system that works for them, not a system that the organization has to work for? This is about roles and responsibilities. This is people doing their work and being comfortable, understanding that the roles and responsibilities that have been assigned to them, that they own those processes. This is really important. If the organization has to work for a system, is there controls in place that are purely there just to get through an audit, that have no benefit to the organization whatsoever? Is there a silo mentality where the QA or food safety function does all of the work instead of really the management system supporting food safety? The second one, uniformity of output. What is the purpose of the food safety management system? Identify the purpose. Has that purpose been met? It's not just about individual requirements. It's not just about a checklist approach. It has to be about uniformity of output, not just uniformity of procedures. Uniformity of procedures will be much more related to a product approach. Remember, uniformity of output is a process approach. And then awareness of food safety objectives at all levels. Have they been fully communicated? Does the organization know what the must-win battles are in terms of food safety? Has that been shared with engineering? Has that been shared with procurement? Has that been shared with logistics, manufacturing, and so on? Has that been clearly understood? And are people all moving in the same direction without conflicts against those objectives? And then last but not least, and probably most importantly, is did the organization meet the objective to continuously improve the effectiveness of their food safety management system? And why is that important? When we look at this example here, we see halfway up from the diagram, performance and compliance. I've seen this in a lot of cases where organizations have adopted more of a product procedure type approach, a checklist approach. They can be conforming to a standard, and the organizations believe they've done enough. However, we see examples with that conformance and compliance approach that there are still food safety recalls, withdrawals, regulatory incidents. A lot of problems are still happening, and an organization is wondering why. In that case, if you see that as an auditor, that the likelihood is that continual improvement cycle and the improvement of the organization to get to the effectiveness and the efficiency at the top of the bar is not happening. So an organization that does not put enough emphasis on continual improvement will likely still have food safety failures despite having conformance against the standard. So is the mindset there that the organization, is the PDCA approach within the organization for the process approach really working for the organization? Have they fully embraced that? And if not, this is an opportunity to make observations against that. This is strengths and weaknesses. So in my experience, I've seen the good, the bad with different organizations. I've seen organizations that stop at conformance and compliance. I've seen organizations that move to the top of the cycle with efficiency and effectiveness. The organizations that get to the top of the cycle, global organizations, global food manufacturers reduce recalls year on year. And that is where the opportunity is for a food safety auditor, is to be able to identify that and call it out as a good thing or an observation for improvement. And then finally, the key takeaway. So I appreciate you watching my presentation today as a food safety auditor. My challenge to you is, are you using the process-based approach? Are you using the supporting tools to audit food safety management systems? So I want you to take that as a key takeaway today. If not, what's your action plan to address this? Will you go back to your organization? Will you look at the standard that you're auditing? Rethink some of the techniques that you've applied? And again, that's, I would welcome the debate, the discussion, and the feedback on this. So I'm Colin Christmas. I want to thank you for my presentation. Thanks for watching. I'm happy to receive emails, continue the debate, and encourage any suggestions or thoughts for improvement. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Colin Christmas, for that look at the process approach to food safety auditing. That concludes this presentation.